Well, thank you very much for joining me as we begin to work our way through John's Gospel. I'm really thrilled that you've investigated what this might be like, or you're willing to give this a shot of working our way through John's Gospel to find out for yourself what John says about Jesus of Nazareth. Now, before we get started, just a few tools that you'll need in your toolkit to dig in to John's Gospel. The Bible is divided up into chapters and verses. The chapters are the big numbers and the verses are the little numbers. We're going to read John chapter 1 verses 1 to 18 in a moment, so you might want to have a Bible open. You'll find the book of John after the Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke. Or if reading's not your thing, just listen as I read it, and then when it comes to working your way through those first three chapters of John's Gospel, there's an audio recording that you can listen to. Now, I will be using word pictures. They're called illustrations to try and help us understand some of the things that John teaches in his book. And I'll draw those word pictures from real life. So if you haven't come across the particular things I'm talking about, the particular narratives or stories, then I've provided a few links that you can go and watch some YouTube clips. Now I'm going to do something else that we need in our toolkit, so to speak, and that's we actually need to pray. But don't worry if you are not used to praying, if you've never prayed, that you actually don't think it's worth a second look. I'm going to pray because I think I need help and I know that God can help us. So I'm just going to say a short prayer. If you want to join with me, do. If you don't, that's absolutely fine. Father, please help me to say those things to help others. Please help us all to see who Jesus Christ is. Amen. Well, I want to begin with the question, why even work our way through John's Gospel? What's the point of looking at a Gospel? Well, John's Gospel is written by one of the key eyewitnesses to the events of Jesus' life and Jesus' ministry. John followed Jesus from the early days, the beginning of Jesus' ministry. John saw Jesus at his trial. John saw Jesus die on the cross. And John saw Jesus rise again from the dead. So this gospel is a great gospel to read if we're wanting not just an eyewitness account like all the other gospels, but an eyewitness account of the main events of Jesus' life, a personal eyewitness account. Jesus calls John the beloved disciple, or John refers to himself as the one whom Jesus loved. He was perhaps one of the closest personal friends of Jesus, and so that's a great reason to be reading this gospel written by John. But let's listen to John and what he says is the reason he's written his gospel, because that's always a good way to understand why somebody's written something, is why they say they've written it. So this is what John himself says in John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So John is writing his gospel for people like you and me so that we can believe and have life. That's why he says he's writing his gospel. Now, just as we begin reading through or working our way through, if you're listening to the audio, working our way through John's gospel, it's worth just becoming familiar with a couple of the themes or ideas that John has all the way through his gospel. Do pick up on these if in our Zoom conversation later you want to, and do ask any questions either by email I'd love to get an email with a question, or when we come to our Zoom conversation, then do ask away then. But I'm just going to read John chapter 1, verses 1 to 18, and draw out two of these big ideas that John will return to all the way through his book. So this is John chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God, whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. The true light which gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, 'He who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me.' For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the only God, who is at the Father's side, has made him known." And there are two things that it would be really great to start to get our heads around. And the first is that God created all things through his Word, who is also God. Now don't worry if some of these ideas are pretty new to you and they're pretty mind-blowing. That's kind of what we'd expect with God, that he is beyond our understanding in many ways. But what John says in verse 1 is this: in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. Of course, there's much debate today about how the universe came to be. There's lots and lots of different views, aren't there? Views from six-day creation all the way through to evolution of an impersonal world. Now, do ask about this. I studied evolutionary biology at university, and it's an area that I love thinking and talking with others about. But what John is talking about here is leaving that question aside of how the world came to be. He's saying that God made everything by speaking through the Word. It's perhaps one of the most important things for us to consider. We live in a universe that is made by God speaking it into being. And that means that God and the universe are not the same thing. God is outside the universe. And yet, the way in which God has created the universe is through the Word as a person, a divine person. And so he says again in verse 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made through him. So whatever we might think about how the world has come to be, what John wants us to understand is God has spoken it into being, and he's done that through a person who is also God. And what that means is that right deep down in the universe, it's not impersonal. Deep down, the origin of the universe, everything that has come to be has come from God, who is a person, who spoke it, created it, through the person of the Word. So that's the first thing we need to grapple with and understand, is that God has made everything through the person of the Word, who is also God. But then the other big thing that John says in verse 14 is that the Word became flesh, became a human being. I'll just read verse 14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we, that includes John, have seen his glory, the glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. You see, John is saying he has met somebody called Jesus, who is God in the flesh. God has become a human being in the person of his Son, Jesus Christ. So God has made everything through his Word, who is a person, who is God, and that person, the Word, has become a human being, who we know as the man Jesus Christ, who walked around on earth 2,000 years ago. Now we might ask, well, why has God become flesh? Why has God, the Word, become a person, human being like you and me? Well, remember what we're thinking about him being personal. God is to be known in personal relationship by people like you and me. Now, I just want to share this word picture with you. I hope this might help you understand what John is saying in this first part of his gospel. You may remember a number of years ago there was a mining accident in Chile. Miners were some 2 kilometers down, deep down in the mine, and there was a rock fall, and the mine collapsed, and there was no way they could work their way back up out of the darkness, back to the light and back to the surface. So over a period of about 2 months, engineers drilled down through the rock and hit the part of the mine where the miners were still safe. And initially, through this hole that they drilled down, they delivered food and water. But eventually, they expanded the hole so that it could take a cage. And the cage was sent down from the light, from the surface, down into the darkness. And then one by one, each of the miners was rescued. They were all rescued. They were all alive. And if that's a picture that's helpful, then use it to understand what John is saying here. What he's saying here is that God the Word has left the light and come down into the darkness of our world. He's become a human being in Jesus Christ. And why has he done that? Well, he's done that so that one by one, in personal relationship with him, we can be rescued from the darkness back to heavenly light, back to what we were made for, which was to be in relationship, personal relationship with the God who made the universe. Well, that's just an introduction, that's just a beginning, but I hope that you enjoy reading the first 3 chapters of John's Gospel, and then when we regather, whether it's one-to-one Zoom or in a group, however we're doing this with you, then you'll ask lots of questions, and maybe as you read or listen to the first 3 chapters of John's Gospel, have a pen, just jot down anything that strikes you, anything that surprises you, anything that shocks you, anything that you think, well, I don't get that, or language that's not particularly straightforward. And I hope that the first time we meet up on Zoom, it'll be a really helpful time for you, but look forward to seeing you then, and thanks for watching.